thank you very much for joining me today. I know it's 4 o'clock in the afternoon, and I'm looking forward to leading this session and the start of a really important conversation. So this session is called Every Child Belongs, Gender Expansiveness, and 2 squared LGBTQ plus inclusion in the early years. And I would also like to start with the land acknowledgement. And this land acknowledgement was shared by a colleague and friend, and it really resonated with me. So I have adapted it, and I'm happy to share the article that informs this land acknowledgement with anybody who's interested after the talk. So this land acknowledgement is informed by a 2019 article written by Selena Mills and Sarah Roque. Tuckeronto, a Mohawk word meaning the place in the water where the trees are standing, the place where the fish weirs are. Tuckeronto, colonially known today as Toronto, has been home to Indigenous peoples for millennia. I live, work, and play within the traditional territory of the Haudenosaunee, the Wendat, Petun, Seneca, and Mohawk, and Mississaugas of the Credit First Nations. Toronto and the GTA are Treaty 13 lands. We're all treaty people, and as such, we have an obligation to recognize the treaty rights of Indigenous people, especially as we continue to see colonial governments side with corporations instead of honoring and respecting treaty rights in Indigenous lands. We have a responsibility to acknowledge how agreements and treaties have been broken, and we must remember that First Nations, Métis, and Inuit peoples are still negotiating and fighting for their rights to these lands. This territory is covered by the Dish with One Spoon Wampum Treaty, a covenant agreement between Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Wendat peoples, and allied nations to peaceably share the land and to care for the relationships around the Great Lakes. By living and working here, we all have a responsibility to care for the land and for each other, to treat each other with peace, friendship, and respect. And for me, whenever I do or think about a land acknowledgement, I also think about my relationship to the land and to education, and in spaces that have been known to colonize and impress Indigenous peoples for millennia, and thinking about how we can actively decolonize the space and think outside of these narratives. And also as a racialized woman, but also a first-generation Canadian whose parents were immigrants as well. And so Emis already introduced me, and that's a little bit of who I am on the slide. My pronouns are she, her, and hers, and my name is Shailja Jain. And so my research that I'm doing in my PhD, and I feel very lucky to be doing, is focused on trans affirmative practice in early childhood and really early childhood pedagogy as well, and thinking about what early childhood educators already know and what we can do and really champion in order to create more trans affirmative or gender expansive spaces. And I'm right in the final stages of my data collection, which is very exciting. For the purposes of this talk today and for this hour that we have together, and hours always go so quickly, I'm going to be focusing mainly on policy, some of the policies that have been popping up across the country, the different ways that gender theories have evolved and the ways that we teach gender theories in our early childhood programs, and then maybe some gaps and opportunities for improvement within the policies that govern our practice in early childhood as well. So again, I really thank you for joining me, and I'm looking forward to starting this important conversation. And so I have a short icebreaker activity, and if you feel comfortable, I'd love for you to share in the chat just what I've highlighted here on the slide. So your name, your pronouns, and an adjective that describes how you're feeling this afternoon. And so one of the reasons that I ask you to share your pronouns if you're comfortable, I use the definition from EGAL a lot in my work, in thinking about how pronouns are such a small way that we respect one another and acknowledge one another as well. And so EGAL says using a person's self-determined pronouns at their request rather than assuming their pronouns is a way of validating that we all have the right to live our truth, to share our truth, and to be granted safety, respect, and dignity in doing so. And I find that so, so important as we navigate these spaces together. It is a respectful and inclusive practice to use neutral pronouns like they, them, theirs when referring to any person whose pronoun you do not yet know until you are able to find out. And this space with the adjective is something that I learned in my master's from Tara Goldstein, and she used this practice to really be real with one another as we're navigating these conversations that are so closely linked to identity and identity work. And it really just gives us that chance to be grateful, to be real with one another, right? And to really be vulnerable and share where we're at and where we're coming to this work from or these conversations from. Awesome. Great. Thank you so much for sharing, everyone. I appreciate it. And I'll pause for a moment just in case anybody else wants to share. It's nice to see so many familiar and also so many new names in the chat. Okay. And I see different emotions popping up as well. So thank you so much for sharing. Um, And I'll get on to the next topic that we'll be talking about. And so I'm going to start by talking about some of the anti-trans policy changes that have been popping up across Canada and how these have changed and evolved. And so I do want to give a little bit of a trigger warning for anybody who's listening or watching or in the audience as well. And I'll share this Canadian anti-trans risk assessment map and talk about it a little bit. I'm just going to change my view here so that I can see everything. And so this risk assessment map was created by Celeste Trianon, and it was updated very recently, just a few weeks ago in July 2025. And so I'm going to talk a little bit about what's changed between January and now, and then I'll get deeper into some of the policies and the risks that some of those policies pose as well to our work in early childhood education, but also just when we think about safety for trans and gender diverse folks. So Celeste says the risk of anti-trans developments remain in particular in Canadian jurisdictions where right-of-center governments are in power. Yet there is reason for hope, especially as some provinces take a stance of leadership, which is desperately needed in these rough times. Something to note, a big change between the January version of this map and this risk tracker, as well as now, is New Brunswick was previously cited as a medium risk based on anti-trans policy changes, but has been updated to low risk because there has been a lack of negative changes in this area and due to a change in government. As you can see on this map, Alberta poses the highest risk. And I'm going to get into some of the specific policy concerns that are happening in this region. I have a slide dedicated to that, unfortunately, after this map. Saskatchewan is coming in as a close second here as well because of the use of the notwithstanding clause of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, amongst other evolving anti-trans policies. Quebec was also notably has changed since the January version of this map because they moved into a moderate high risk. You see the exclamation mark there that indicates that there's an imminent risk of further anti-trans developments. And Ontario has stayed in this color as a moderate risk because we have yet to see what will happen in terms of gender affirming policies in this province, and some things have popped up. Something else to note when we look at this map, and it's important to have risk trackers like this, is that the whole country is noted to be a moderate risk with that exclamation mark in place when we think about imminent risk of further anti-trans developments, right? And so it's a very scary time when we think about Canadian policy and the types of anti-trans rhetoric that has popped up across the country. And it does seep into our work all the time. I know in doing sector workshops and in speaking with educators, there have been more parents that have been pushing back against gender inclusive practice in the classroom, which is really upsetting to hear. We're coming out of Pride. Some of the conversations that educators or even managers have been having with families have been very different than in previous years. And so thinking about this legislation and these policy changes and what they signal to be okay versus not okay is really important to note. And I'm happy to share the link to this anti-trans risk assessment map as well for anybody who's interested, or even if you were to look up Celeste Tran, and you can easily find it as well. Okay. And so I have this slide here that highlights some of the problematic policy changes to gender inclusive policy that have come up in Alberta since Danielle Smith came into power. And some of these fall into the category of health amendments and some fall into education amendments and are bills that are in negotiation or are trying to be passed through. And so I'm going to go through some of what's on the slide and then really just talk about the impact here. So in Alberta's changes, under the changes to gender inclusive policy, there are restrictions to things like puberty blockers or gender affirming care for children under the age of 15 years. This is really problematic because we know that what puberty blockers do, they're very minimally invasive and they actually just delay a puberty, right? And so they actually do the opposite of doing something that is irreversible, right? And when they stop, then a puberty would continue maybe 6 months after a puberty blocker. And restricting gender affirming care has really harmful circumstances for trans children who may be going through puberty in a body that doesn't fit for them, right? It can bring up a lot of things. Thinking about how gender reassignment surgery is also banned for children under 17 years of age. Parents need to give permission for a child to use preferred pronouns or a chosen name for children under 15. And here, really thinking about how this puts parents and children on opposite teams, right? We have a really big strength in early childhood where we're able to bring families and parents into conversations in ways that are still safe for children, but thinking about children who live in homes where it's not safe for them to use their chosen names or their chosen pronouns, and then now taking away that safe place of school as well. Teachers require ministry approval before teaching about gender identity in schools, which is a big shift, right? From having this be embedded as part of our human rights code and something that is taught about. And another big change here is that parents will also have to opt children into lessons at school about gender diversity rather than opt children out, right? Which says a lot about whose identities are valued and validated and whose are not, which is very problematic. And these changes really violate the Human Rights Code, and they also constitute very unsafe circumstances for gender diverse as well as trans youth. It's really important to consider that trans youth live in households that are not always gender inclusive. And these policies, as I mentioned earlier, really take away the school as a safe space and stop them from knowing and affirming who they are. This can cause depression, and it does lead to a higher rate of suicide when we know that suicide rates are already very high for trans youth. And research has shown us that having supportive adults or adults that are gender affirming and support a child's identity or affirm a child's identity have been seen to reduce a suicide attempt by 94%. It's not a small percentage, it's a huge percentage. So to take away that adult support has a very negative and very harmful effect. And I just want to connect this with human rights. And I talked about this a little bit on the previous slide as well as with the map, but just thinking about two aspects, and there's many more aspects of the Human Rights Code that applies here. But when we think about these two aspects, and I'm just going to read through them, and I want you to kind of think about how these policies really violate, these policy changes that infringe on gender affirming care really violate children's rights and the rights that they have to be who they are. So the first, children have the right to their own identity, an official record of who they are, which includes their name, nationality, and family relations. No one should take this away from them, but if this happens, governments must quickly help children to quickly get their identity back. And so thinking about what the government is doing in this case in Alberta and how this is in direct conflict with a child's right to identity. And the second one, children have the right to give their opinions freely on issues that affect them. Adults should listen and take children seriously. And this comes into practice in all that we do, and it comes into policy too. Our policy documents say that children are capable and competent, right? And as educators, as professionals who work in the sector, we have an ethical obligation to believe children when they tell us who they are and to believe the knowledge that they have about themselves and create space for them to really be who they are. And I have this quotation here from Steele and Nicholson, and I thought that this was so relevant in relation to this conversation and in relation to these policies, and something to just consider in moving forward. And it's the why, right? The why we're in the sector, the why we're here, trying to create better environments for trans and gender diverse children and all children. And so I'll just read through it here for a moment of reflection. Um, so every young child deserves to feel seen and heard as their authentic self and to be in the care of responsive adults who are committed to helping them feel a strong sense of safety, visibility, and belonging in the classroom. This requires that children enter early childhood environments from birth that communicate and reinforce to trans and gender expansive children through words and actions and the planning and arranging of the environment positive and affirming messages of who they are and an overall value for gender diversity. And I thought that this underscores this conversation so perfectly. Because what's at stake for many children, for all children, for gender diverse children, is that many gender diverse children do not find the language that represents how they identify until late into adolescence. And if we take that away in early childhood, we're reinforcing representations of language that are not inclusive and do not create feelings of belonging. It impacts livability for gender diverse and two-squared LGBTQ plus children, thinking of belonging as a whole, and really dismissing children's identities takes away their agency and dismisses the knowledge that they have about themselves. And I mentioned this a little bit earlier on the previous slide, but as educators, we have an ethical responsibility to act in the best interest of the child. And educators also navigate relationships with families and recognize that families know and love their children, right? And we have an opportunity in early childhood where we can really support families by bringing in resources that support inclusion, helping children and families navigate difficult conversations, and share knowledge of the importance of identity and affirmation during the early years with families as well. I'm going to switch gears a little bit now, and I'm going to walk you through an evolution, just a quick evolution of the way that gender theory has changed. And thankfully, it has changed quite a bit, the way that we teach gender theory in early childhood. And I know some of my colleagues, we teach this together that are here in the room. And so I feel lucky to be joined by them here, but also when we're teaching about topics like this. And so I'll walk you through this in the way that gender theories have changed. And so the first, when we think about the gender binary, this is a common system of thought which presumes that all people's gender identity fits into two rigidly fixed categories, male or female. In this system, gender identity is assumed to correlate with assigned sex. And so it leaves many, many people out of the conversation, right? When we're thinking about only having those two rigidly fixed categories, trans and gender diverse children are left out, but also children that don't rigidly fit into those categories are left out as well. Gender boxes really aligns with the gender binary as well, and it takes up gender as binary, as fixed, and it goes very specifically to identify what it means to be a very specific idea of a boy or a girl. So again, here, gender fluidity is completely left out of the conversation. And when we think about trans and gender diverse youth, there's no representation or belonging present within these theories. It also examines gender as predetermined by biological sex and highlights, as I mentioned, only one way to be female or male. So this is extremely limiting. And I talked about this a little bit in the podcast. And you can see in the diagram that's on the slide, right? It says boy, and then it says plays with trucks, doesn't cry. You see these really harmful stereotypes and limiting stereotypes that manifest here. And under girl is attracted to boys. So it even talks about dictating sexual orientation or plays with dolls and wears dresses. And when we imagine the child this way, we keep them innocent in a way that we control who they're going to be and the way that they're going to be that. And that's quite problematic, right? And we're also limiting important STEM opportunities for all children. And creating a lot of feelings of not fitting, of not being able to belong and not being able to fit into that rigid box or rigid mold of what's described here. When we think about the genderbread person, And so all of these three theories, we've kind of shifted away from these. And this one, I even used to use it a lot when I started doing these workshops, maybe like 8 years ago or something like that, because I thought it was better than what existed at the time. Um, and so it's a good starting point to really understand some key terms. And what I like about it is it puts things like gender identity and gender expression on a spectrum. But it still is part of the gender binary because you still are either man, woman, or somewhere in the middle, right? It's very limiting still, and you have to belong with on this spectrum. It isn't open-ended, and further examination is really required to look beyond the gender binary and gender spectrum. Um, and I'll move beyond this. Again, it sometimes is used in workshops, right? To think about where do these terms belong on the body, right? And to get you to think about it that way in a more expressive kind of way. But I really like this model. And when we think about what is gender expansive, and I'll go through the definition here, and really what this has to offer that is so much more than the model that I showed you previously. And so when we think about gender expansiveness, this can be defined as gender as complex, dynamic, individually determined, separate from sexual orientation, and related to other identities. It's intersectional. And so this image, this diagram is from Steele and Nicholson's Gender Justice Collective, and they have a lot of really great resources for early childhood on that website. Um, but this model, you can see it's much, much more expansive. It has a really great way of looking at the whole child in a holistic way and breaking down each of the different interconnected social aspects of identity. And so this is where race comes into the picture, ability, and all other aspects, all other social aspects of identity. So we're not just looking at the child for one piece of identity, right? But we really are given a chance to view the child for who they are, and there's agency in the way that they tell us. So the way that this model breaks down gender, you can see it says, I identify as, my identity is fluid or fixed. My pronouns are, my body has. When I was born, people thought I was, and now people look at me and see, and I want them to see. So it also takes into account the way that we express ourselves and the way that we're read in different social situations. And really, intersectionality is a huge piece here. Something that works in conjunction with this model is the gender web. And so this is Diane Aronsaf's model, and it takes into account three different threads: nature, nurture, and culture. And this model is really important, similarly to the previous one, because it gives the child a lot of agency in who they are, and it gives us the opportunity to look at the whole child and how they're actively creating these major threads that builds a web of who they are. And you can see that these models are all really building towards something. And in the later ones with gender expansiveness and the gender web, and the one that I'll share with you in just a moment, you can really see the shift, right? That we're thinking about the agency that a child has, but also a shift in educators in the way that we view children and what is our image of the child as well. I saw some questions pop up in the chat, so we'll just pause for a second if there are questions. I'm not able to share my PowerPoint, but I'm happy to chat about anything afterwards, for sure. And I believe the video of this talk is going to be circulated later as well. I'll share my email, and I think the Atkinson Center is going to post the video or email it to you as well if you're registered here.
Yes, it'll be posted on our website following in a few days.
Awesome. Thank you. And so this model is my favorite model to teach about gender with, and even to think about with educators when we think about how we view children. And so I'll talk a little bit about why and what this offers. And I've grounded my research a lot within this model as well. And it belongs to Steele and Nicholson, and they talk about it a lot in their book called Radically Listening to Transgender Children. And it's an incredible read for anybody who does any kind of work in the sector. It thinks about epistemic injustice and the way that we can really create environments that are full of gender justice as well. And so the gender constellation here, you can see that the child is actively in this model and is drawing their own gender constellation. So there are many stars that connect different elements of what the child wants to share with you. And it includes Some of the aspects of the gender constellation are socially imposed, and some are freely chosen by children. And children really have a lot of agency here to keep the branches that are relevant for them and to erase the ones that no longer make sense for them. And you can see that some lines are connected and some are not. Steele and Nicholson say instead of a person's gender being a single location, they view an individual's gender as a unique constellation where one can connect the dots of their unique combination of the many different aspects of gender. So this model is really intersectional and deeply regards the whole child. Um, it also really values the way that children know themselves and encourages us as educators to really practice active listening. It's a big piece here. When we think about having the privilege for a child to share with us who they are, the way that we believe them, the way that we embed that within our work, and the way that we are open to being changed by what a child shares with us, which is how it should be in that reciprocal relationship. So as I mentioned, this model is intersectional. It also moves away from Western models of gender that are rooted in developmentalism as well as the gender binary. Instead, Steele and Nicholson here argue that the intersectional gender constellation model explicitly acknowledges that an individual's experiences with gender are significantly influenced by their other social identity categories, categories that they claim, or those that they don't claim but might be attributed to them, and the privileges and or marginalization and social inequities that are associated with each of these categories. This model is situated within a paradigm shift that moves towards having more affirmation for children, and we're seeing that within early childhood. We can see the impact that parental and educators' support can have in a child's life. And community support, and also embracing this multiplicity of gender. And Jake Pine really talks about this paradigm shift. This is really significant and important because it does signal a possibility for transformational change when gender and identity are meaningfully included within practice. And it is being taught in pre-service programs before educators go into the field, which is so important just when you think about what is the image of the child and how do educators approach children, right? Being ready to actively listen or affirm identity in something like a simple moment. And I'll share an example of this later on. And I spoke about this kind of organically, but just to summarize a little bit, some of the ways that the gender expansive models, the later ones that I shared, are applied in the early childhood classroom and in pedagogy are through gender affirming language. And I mentioned this earlier that many trans and gender diverse youth don't find the words to describe how they identify until late into adolescence, right? And so, how can we actively work to disrupt that and create better and more livable circumstances for all children, and even understanding for children of others, right? This language includes how we refer to one another, songs in the room, ways of addressing the group, and creating spaces for children to really just be who they are. Another piece here is representation, and there's so many different forms of representation. One of the first one is children's books, but when we think about books, and there's so many really incredible children's books that focus on gender, we could spend the whole time just talking about that, but thinking about the books that we choose and how they need to be outside of this deficit-based narrative, right? So not always looking at gender as an issue, but just as something that's there in the story. Like maybe there is a gender diverse character, maybe it's an intersectional character as well. And they're just doing something, right? It's not necessarily that gender is the main issue of the story. And then actively having educators use these books to have conversations with children and also with families. It can be a really incredible pedagogical tool. Um, and then also really thinking about the messages that children are getting from a particular book. I know in my own research, when I was exploring a book and talking with educators about it, thinking about who is the character that intervenes, right? Is it an adult or is it another child? And what are the hidden messages within that, right? Do other children bully the child? Do they think they'll be treated that way by expressing themselves authentically? These are really important questions to consider that go beyond just like this is a book and it's on my shelf in my classroom, right? Also having pictures in the room in many contexts, having pictures of different types of families, and hopefully they're the families that are at the center as well, in the room and in other areas of the room. And then in practice, right, not separating children based on sex when we think about activities. Often, a long time ago, we used to say girls over here and boys over here, or girls and boys do this, or some of those songs at the beginning of the day that label children based on sex, right? Thinking about how we can use other language, more gender affirmative language. And there's some really great resources and other songs to include here as well. Because not only does this leave trans and gender diverse children out of the narrative, but it denies opportunities from all children. Um, and so I want to talk a little bit now. I have three different examples of policy-based inclusion. And in this section of this talk, I'm really just looking at some opportunities where policies can be reimagined to really better serve early childhood educators as well as children and families, but also looking at what they do already, right? So starting with what's already being done and where can we improve. And so the first thing I want to look at is how does learning happen? And how does learning happen? As you all know, it's quite essential, right? It guides so much of our practice and what we do and what we're able to do within the early childhood classroom. And so this image of the triangle that I have here is so central to how does learning happen, and thinking about how relationships are so at the front and forefront of what we do and drive so many elements of practice, of pedagogy, and what we do as educators. When we think about a sense of belonging and how does learning happen, it outlines that early childhood programs cultivate authentic and caring relationships and connections to create a sense of belonging among and between children, adults, and the world around them. And so thinking about how relationships are so intertwined with that sense of belonging, right? And how children need to have those reciprocal relationships where they really feel seen and heard in order to feel like they belong. Um, and then in the overview, it also talks about relationships. It thinks about how young children experience their world as an environment of relationships, which affect virtually all aspects of their development. And so something that stood out to me and stands out to me in my research and my work is that gender isn't explicitly mentioned within how does learning happen. Identity is in the place that I mentioned. I've copied onto the slide when we think about health and well-being on that graph. And it says ways in which children might demonstrate health and well-being would be they are developing a strong sense of self and the ability to value their own unique identity, or they are increasingly able to recognize, value, and respect the unique identity and perspectives of others. And so this is a really good start, right? When we think about how we conceptualize identity in early childhood, and again, how do we regard children for all of who they are? But these pieces, when we think about belonging, when we think about identity, they're still not specific enough to really give educators agency in those moments that can be really difficult, like where a parent is pushing back if there's a boy child in the dramatic center that wants to wear a dress and their parents don't agree, right? So even in the simple moment of dramatic play, this policy document doesn't have something that is so specific enough to really explicitly stand out to that parent and say, no, I'm okay to do this in my practice. And why that's a problem is because it really places individual responsibility on educators to do this work without providing the systemic supports required to do this. Culture is often mentioned in how does learning happen, but gender is actually not mentioned throughout. And so it's important to think about that because as early childhood educators, we're in a profession that is often devalued, right? And is not given systemic support and requires a lot stronger policy supports to practice and to do this work. And so Timmons and Ayrton really talk about this. And I'm mentioning these things quickly just in the interest of time. But I found this quotation to be really, really meaningful. And so I'll go through it and then just talk about it a little bit. So they highlight that it is worth acknowledging that ECEs are rarely provided with paid time to plan or access resources that would allow them to integrate gender expansive practices, like having the time to locate and integrate the books we were talking about earlier with transgender and or gender nonconforming characters. These challenges are exacerbated by the additional strained practical environments that ECEs work in, which include the high number of children in their care and minimal breaks. These structural issues serve to undermine the abilities of ECEs to uphold their professional obligations in all areas of their practice. And it's really important for us to remember this, right? When we think about how ECEs are already doing very hard work that is not often given credit, it's often devalued. And so it's not enough to just say, this is what we do pedagogically, and you need to go and do this other thing. We have to really support educators so that this isn't another thing. It's closely linked to the heart of the work. And so some recommendations here would be to have strong director and manager support. And many educators do have strong manager and director support in doing gender justice work, but not all educators do, right? And they need this in order to be able to pursue gender affirming practices and feel comfortable doing so. We need to have policies that are explicit when it comes to supporting the center's position on inclusion of trans and gender expansive children and families. And lastly, better systemic supports for educators to enable them to pursue this work. It shouldn't be individual accountability and responsibility. The next piece that I want to share with you is an artistic tableau created by my friend and colleague, Benjamin Lee Hicks. And this tableau really focuses on acceptance versus tolerance, and what it means or what it looks like to really be left out of that narrative, or when someone's making decisions without really considering, the people who are being affected or impacted. And I want you to just independently reflect. I'm not going to ask you to share in the interest of time, but just to think about what comes up for you in relation to this tableau and how does this relate to your own experiences in the sector. And so I'll read through it and then share some of the experiences when I'm doing these kinds of workshops that educators have shared with me, and I have permission to do that. So in the first image here, you see a winged person. And you see a doorway, and you can see that the wings are wider than the door frame. And it says in the first bubble, that person is not going to fit. And then in the second one, it says, yeah, but we can't be expected to expect that. And then in the second square here, it says there's two people who look like maybe administrators standing on the steps of the door frame, and they say, look, we have accommodated you and you're welcome. And there's a separate entrance, and the sign is kind of janky, right? It's crooked, and it says winged people entrance. In the third one, you really see all of these people climbing up the steps and going into the school, and the winged person enters in this separate entrance that is clearly just for them, and it's got this shadow, and you see a lot of emotion with the way that it's highlighted in gray when everything else in this place is colored. And then in the bottom half, it says, how can I explain the feeling of not being expected? Right? And so thinking about what it means to really accept and think about belonging in our policies and our practices and the ways that we treat children and families versus just tolerating, right? Or lip service. And something that comes up a lot is the safe and positive space posters, which are really good. They're really important, just like having a separate entrance is important, but they really need to be paired with action, right? Another piece that comes up often is gender inclusive washrooms, because when we have gender inclusive washrooms in schools, they're often in front of the principal's office and you have to get a key, and they're heavily surveilled, right? And so really just asking that question of, when we have these separate policies or these inclusion policies, how can we make it so we're really prefacing and emphasizing acceptance, right? Many educators have shared that it makes them think about, why couldn't we have a ramp into the school or an accessible entrance that works for multiple children? And really, that's what inclusion and UDL and all these pieces is all about, right? If you make it better for one person, you're making it better for many, many people, right? And thinking about acceptance here and how that's at the heart of the work that we do. And then my last piece of policy that I wanted to share with you, and I know it's been a lot in like a short amount of time, and I'll just go through this quickly. I'm not going to read through the whole thing, but this is a sample of a piece of a childcare policy of a center in Toronto, and I've anonymized the policy. It doesn't say where it's from at all. But something I really liked about this policy when I've been looking through different childcare inclusion policies is it actually mentions gender, which um, a lot of policies don't. It talks about inclusive programming, which many do, self-expression, those kinds of pieces. Respect for diversity, equality, and inclusion is highlighted. But it also mentioned here, recognize and respect the unique qualities of each child and family, including ancestry, culture, ethnicity, race, language, gender identity, sexual orientation, religion, socioeconomic status, family environment, developmental abilities, and needs. So it was one of the only policies I found, and I'm sure there are many more, but in looking through policies, it was one that explicitly named gender and gender identity, which is so important. Something that is missing is one of those pieces where we think about um, letting everybody play with everything, right? Or again, having those specific supports in place so that if educators are to pursue gender affirming practices and they get pushback from parents, they have this policy document that's able to back them up. And it doesn't come back to that individual responsibility or individual accountability, right? And even when we think about things that way, when we put it in an individual accountability, we're trusting that that educator wants to pursue that kind of gender justice work instead of setting up the environment that those are aspects of human rights that we always include in our practice, right? And so lots of things to think about here. And I wanted to end this talk today just by highlighting a simple moment of inclusion in early childhood education. And often this work is so overcomplicated. And I know in connecting with many educators in the sector, that educators will tell me, I'm scared to do it wrong. Or even my students will say that sometimes, I'm scared to say the wrong thing, right? And we overcomplicate it. But often saying something and doing something small works just as efficiently to be gender affirming. So I wanted to share this tableau from Steele and Nicholson's work in their research, and it focuses on an educator and a child in a preschool room. And so I'll just read through it. Hal 3 is playing by himself in a sandbox. Luke, a teacher, sits nearby. I'm a kitten, Hal suddenly announces. Luke responds, Hello, kitty. Hal pauses and then continues. I'm a flying kitten. The teacher replies, Ah, flying kitten. After another pause, Hal adds, I'm a flying kitten named Felix. The teacher smiles. Hal is often a flying kitten named Felix. I'm a flying kitten named Felix, who's a girl kitten. Hal looks up at his teacher, a grin spreading wide across his face. Luke smiles back and comments, I see, you're a girl kitten named Felix. How do you fly? Hal lifts his elbows, see my wings, and flies off. And so it's these simple moments, right? It's the ways that this educator didn't shy away, but really let the child take the lead and share more and more in this like layered way in their play that works as gender affirmation. And it can be these really simple moments. And I think that can be really relatable for educators when you think back, and many educators are already doing this and thinking about what's a simple moment where I affirmed a child's identity, right? When I was lucky when they shared with me and I affirmed it, right? And I think this can be a really great starting place for all of us in doing and in navigating this work. And so I just really want to thank you very much for your time and engagement and share my email here on the slides. I know it was a very short talk and a lot of things in a short amount of time. So if you have any other questions or comments, feel free to connect with me, and my email's here on the slide. I'll leave it up for a moment and then I'll just stop sharing and pass it back to Amis.
Thank you so much, Shailja. That was wonderful, and I've heard you speak many times, and you always have me engaged and listening. So thank you so much for that. As in previous webinars, you are more than welcome to ask some questions that we have you can add in the chat. The question will come to the hosts, so others won't see your questions. So I'll kick it off while people maybe take this time to think of any questions that they might have for you, Shailja. And then we'll share the email again in the chat. So the question I have, Shailja, is what are some of the biggest gaps that you have seen in educator preparation programs, like college programs, when it comes to gender expansive pedagogy?
I think that's a really great question. And I feel really lucky to be on a team that's looking at our pedagogy and revamping it so that gender expansiveness is embedded within all of our classes and our programming. But I do think in many programs, we're still teaching gender binary and gender boxes. And if we're not, then there's still a lot of spaces where folks are afraid to teach gender expansiveness wrong. And so it's missing from a lot of narratives or maybe just isolated into one course instead of spread out across a program. And often topics like gender expansiveness or anti-racism or those kinds of things are an opt-in rather than an embedded throughout, I think would be a big gap.
Okay. Another question is, we talk about parents being the experts in understanding their children. How can we support RECEs in navigating pushback or discomfort from families or staff when implementing trans affirmative practices?
I think this is a really, really important question. And parents and families love their children, right? And nobody's questioning that. And I think we have a really unique position in early childhood where, as I mentioned earlier, we can really bring families into these conversations when it's safe to do so, and to have these difficult conversations with families because we get to know them in such a genuine and meaningful way. But I really think it does come down to having that director and supervisor support and having explicit policies that back up educators so they can say, for example, if it's the dramatic center or if it's a child wanting to use a name, that this is what we accept and this is how we practice within our center.
Great. Thank you. I'm just looking here. Another question is, what advice would you give to educators who want to advocate for more inclusive policies in their programs or boards, but feel isolated or unsupported?
I think this is such a great question. And it's something that a lot of us grapple with, right? Being educator can be such precarious work and it can be difficult and you can feel isolated, but there are really incredible spaces where you can find community. I know the 519 is really great. There's other organizations and the Gender Justice Collective, and there's a lot of people doing this kind of work. So we can always share resources and think about people to connect with. And I'm happy to connect with anybody after who wants to talk more about that piece and getting involved in how to do that work. And I think just doing it, just showing up and saying it, even if it's scary, but saying we need to have this here, we need to practice this here in spaces where you feel safe doing that is so important and can make such an incredible difference.
We have a two-part question here around maybe sharing some of the children's books or visual materials that support gender diversity in early years classrooms that you may have and you may know of, if that's something that you can share with us, and then we can send out to registrants of the webinar, or if there's any that you want to specifically speak to, and what kinds of professional development or training would help educators feel more confident having these conversations with children and families. And I think that's a really important one because often it's the material and the confidence are kind of two things, right? We give the resources, but how do we teach that confidence to have those conversations? So those are just two questions if you want to address.
A couple books that I would say are really great, and I have this at my fingertips because it's part of my research right now. I love the book The Boy and the Bindi because it's an intersectional gender diverse character, and it also puts together the parenting relationship in a really positive way, where often a lot of things will separate out parents, and so it's a nice like calling in book, and it's by Vivek Shreya, who's a trans of color author that's Toronto based. And then another one that I would recommend offhand is The Stars in the Sky and the Fish in the Sea by Kai Cheng Tom, who's also a Toronto-based author, trans author. And this book really thinks about multiple ways of being and brings up really incredible conversations with children in the classroom. I can think about other ones, even like Morris Micklewhite and the Tangerine Dress, but really just paying attention to what is the storyline and who's questioning who, I think is really important, and some good feedback that I've been given for sure. And what was the second part of the question, Amis?
About the PD piece for educator confidence
Yeah,
online.
I think that's a really important piece. I know I've done a lot of workshops for Peel and Durham and gone into different school boards and childcare centers and just had conversations with educators with different case studies and scenarios and thinking about how could we do this together, or what are the things you would say, and like practicing and just doing it, and even finding like a buddy to do that kind of practice with. But kinds of PD sessions where you can actually practice pedagogical strategies, I think make a really, really big difference and help people feel confident for sure.
Another two-part question is that, sorry, so you did talk in the beginning around not making assumptions about pronouns. How do we ask families about their child's gender expression or needs during intake in a respectful, optional way?
I think that intake forms can ask for pronouns, and that's a really simple, respectful way. And I've had that conversation with a lot of supervisors, how they added that piece into their intake forms. And so it's just kind of implied and part of the conversation, and it really sets the stage for families to also know the values and ethics of that center when it comes to gender expansive practice.
Another question, are there tools to audit ECE programs for gender bias?
Yes, there are. And actually, Katie Steele and Danielle Nicholson have a really incredible tool with the Gender Justice Collective that helps you do like a self audit of your classroom to think about gender bias and that kind of thing. So it's a great resource.
Another question is that how do we navigate disagreement between family beliefs and program inclusion policies?
I think it's a really big question, and it's always a struggle, and it's something that a lot of educators face. So if you're facing that, please don't feel like you're alone in that discussion. It's always about having those conversations with families, and sometimes they are going to be really, really difficult. And having that manager and supervisor support to support you in having those conversations. So trying to think about simple things like everybody can play with everything here. We accept different pronouns, we accept different names, and those kinds of practices. And if a family is still pushing back, then maybe escalating that conversation and asking for additional support, I think is the way that these conversations have gone in practice before as well.
Okay, great. And I don't think there's any more questions that have come in the chat. So, yep, no more questions. I would like to thank you, Shailja, for your generosity of your time and your expertise. The webinar recording will be posted on our Atkinson YouTube page, and those that have registered will be notified when the recording is posted. Thank you again, Shailja, and have a great evening, everyone.